Since childhood, Aunt Linda whispered, "Your parents are monsters. I'm the only one who loves you." She'd take me on weekends, shower me with expensive gifts, and when I turned 18, she suggested I sue my mom and dad. Until I found that tape. I'm sitting here at 3 a.m., my hands still shaking from what I discovered yesterday. My whole life has been a lie, and I don't even know where to begin processing this mess. I guess I'll start from the beginning and hope that writing this down helps me make sense of it all. Growing up, I always thought I was the unluckiest kid in the world. My parents seemed cold, distant, almost like they were walking on eggshells around me. They never raised their voices, never showed much emotion, and honestly, I thought they just didn't care about me. Every conversation felt stilted and weird, like they were reading from a script or something. Then there was Aunt Linda. She was my mom's sister, and from as far back as I can remember, she was my safe haven. She'd pick me up every other weekend, sometimes more if I begged hard enough. Her house was like a wonderland compared to the tomb-like silence of my parents' place. She had the latest video games, a pool table, and she'd take me to amusement parks, movies, fancy restaurants, basically anywhere I wanted to go. The contrast was so stark it hurt. At home, my parents would make me do chores, stick to a bedtime, and limit my screen time. At Aunt Linda's, I could stay up as late as I wanted, eat whatever I craved, and she'd buy me anything that caught my eye. She'd tell me stories about how creative and intelligent I was, how I deserved so much better than the life my parents were giving me. But it wasn't just the material stuff that drew me to her. She listened to me. Really listened. When I complained about my parents being too strict, she'd nod sympathetically and say things like, "They don't understand you like I do," or "You deserve parents who actually care about your happiness." She had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in her world. As I got older, maybe around 12 or 13, her comments about my parents started getting more pointed. She'd ask me if they ever hit me, if they made me feel bad about myself, if they compared me to other kids. When I'd say no, she'd get this concerned look and say, "Sweetie, sometimes the worst abuse is the kind you don't even realize is happening." That really messed with my head. I started analyzing every interaction with my parents through this lens Aunt Linda had given me. When my dad would remind me to clean my room, I'd think, he's trying to control me. When my mom would ask about my homework, I'd hear, she doesn't trust me. Every normal parental action became evidence of this emotional abuse that Aunt Linda insisted was happening. The weekends at her place became my escape from what I'd convinced myself was a toxic home environment. She'd validate all my frustrations, telling me that my parents were probably jealous of my potential, that they were trying to keep me small so they could feel better about themselves. It sounds ridiculous now, but when you're a confused teenager and the only adult who seems to understand you is telling you these things, you believe them. When I turned 16, Aunt Linda started planting bigger ideas in my head. She'd casually mentioned that I could probably get emancipated if I wanted to, that I didn't have to wait until 18 to break free from my parents' control. She even offered to help me find the right resources, said she'd support me through the whole process. I was so tempted. The idea of finally being free from what I thought was an oppressive household was incredibly appealing. But something held me back. Maybe some deep-down instinct that this wasn't right, or maybe just fear of taking such a huge step. Either way, I decided to wait it out until I could leave for college. My parents seemed to sense something was changing. They tried to engage me in conversations about my future, ask about my interests, suggest family activities. But by then, I was so convinced they were just putting on an act that I'd respond with minimal effort. I see now how much that must have hurt them, but at the time, I thought I was protecting myself from their manipulation. The strangest thing was how they never said anything negative about Aunt Linda, even though I was pretty open about preferring her company to theirs. They just get this sad, resigned look when I talk about my weekends with her, like they were carrying some heavy burden they couldn't share. Senior year of high school, Aunt Linda really ramped up her campaign. She started talking about how I could probably sue my parents for emotional damages, how there were lawyers who specialized in cases like mine. She'd show me articles about kids who had successfully taken their parents to court for psychological abuse. She made it sound like I'd be some kind of hero, standing up for myself and other kids in similar situations. The day I turned 18, she presented me with a business card for a family law attorney. She said she'd already spoken to him about my case, that he was interested in representing me. All I had to do was call and set up a consultation. She'd even offered to pay all the legal fees. I was seriously considering it. My relationship with my parents had deteriorated to the point where we barely spoke beyond the basics. I felt like I was living with strangers who happened to share my DNA. Aunt Linda's offer felt like a lifeline, a chance to finally get the justice I thought I deserved. But then college started, and I got caught up in the whirlwind of new experiences. I made friends, discovered interests I never knew I had, and slowly started to gain some perspective on my childhood. Being away from both my parents and Aunt Linda gave me space to think more clearly about everything. I noticed that other people's relationships with their parents weren't perfect, but they also weren't the nightmarish scenarios Aunt Linda had convinced me mine was. My roommate would complain about his parents being overprotective, but he'd also light up when they called or visited. My girlfriend would roll her eyes at her mom's nagging, but she'd also seek her advice when she was struggling with something important. I started to wonder if maybe I'd been too harsh in my judgment of my parents. They'd never been cruel or abusive, just distant and awkward. Maybe there was more to the story than I understood. Still, Aunt Linda's influence was strong. She'd call me regularly, checking in on how I was doing, reminding me that the legal option was still on the table. She'd send care packages filled with expensive stuff my parents couldn't afford, little reminders of how much better she could provide for me than they could. Update 1. I graduated college last year and moved back to my hometown while I figured out my next steps. Living at home again after 4 years away was complicated. My parents seemed genuinely happy to have me back, but there was still this weird tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. They'd try to connect with me, ask about my plans, offer to help in various ways. But something felt off about their approach. They were almost too careful, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. I chalked it up to us being strangers after so many years of barely communicating. Aunt Linda was thrilled that I was back in town. She wanted to see me constantly, kept suggesting we should spend more time together now that I was an adult. She'd make comments about how I was wasting my potential living with my parents, how I should be focusing on building my own life instead of falling back into old patterns. A few months after I moved back, my dad had a heart attack. It wasn't massive, but it was serious enough to require surgery and a long recovery period. I remember being at the hospital, watching my mom pace the waiting room, and feeling this strange disconnect. Here was this woman who was supposed to be my mother, clearly terrified of losing her husband, and I felt like I was watching a stranger's pain. When Aunt Linda showed up at the hospital, she immediately took charge. She brought coffee for everyone, made sure my mom was eating, coordinated with the medical staff. She was everything you'd want in a family member during a crisis: caring, organized, supportive. But there was something about the way she interacted with my parents that struck me as odd. She was helpful, yes, but there was an underlying coldness to it. Like she was going through the motions of being a good sister without any genuine warmth behind it. My dad recovered well, but the whole experience left me thinking about mortality and family relationships. I started making more of an effort to connect with my parents, though it still felt forced and awkward. They seemed appreciative but also surprised by my attempts at closeness, which made me sad in a way I couldn't quite explain. Around this time, my mom started dropping hints about wanting to show me old family photos and videos. She'd mentioned boxes of memories in the attic, suggest we should go through them together sometime. I kept putting her off, partly because I was busy, but mostly because I still felt uncomfortable with the idea of getting too sentimental about a childhood I remembered as largely unhappy. Aunt Linda was not a fan of this new development. She'd make comments about how my parents were probably trying to rewrite history, how people often romanticize the past when they're feeling guilty about their mistakes. She warned me not to let them manipulate me with nostalgia, to remember how they'd really treated me growing up. Her warnings felt less compelling than they used to, though. Maybe it was because I was older, or maybe because I'd seen how genuinely scared my mom had been when my dad was in the hospital. Either way, I was starting to question whether my memories of my childhood were as accurate as I'd always believed. One evening, about 6 months after my dad's heart attack, my mom approached me about going through those old photos. She seemed nervous, almost like she was afraid I'd reject her offer. Something about her vulnerability made me say yes. We spent the whole night in the attic, going through boxes and boxes of memories. There were pictures of me as a baby, videos of my first steps, report cards from elementary school. What struck me most was how present my parents were in all of it. They weren't the distant, disinterested figures I remembered. In these photos and videos, they looked like loving, engaged parents. There was this one video from my 6th birthday party that really got to me. I was opening presents, and my parents were right there with me, their faces lit up with genuine joy as they watched me discover each gift. My mom was taking pictures while my dad helped me with the wrapping paper, and they both looked so happy to be part of that moment. I asked my mom why I didn't remember them being so involved, and she got this pained expression on her face. She said something about how memory can be tricky, how our perception of events can change over time. She seemed like she wanted to say more but held herself back. That night planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't shake. If my parents had been as loving and present as these photos suggested, why did I remember my childhood so differently? And why did they seem so hesitant to talk about the past in any detail? Update 2. The breakthrough came completely by accident. My mom had been dealing with a lot of stress at work, and her doctor suggested she try some relaxation techniques. She'd been going through old belongings looking for a meditation book she thought she'd packed away, and she asked if I could help her search the basement storage room. We were moving boxes around, checking labels and dates, when I came across a cardboard box marked Legal Documents, 1999 to 2003. I was about to set it aside when something made me pause. The date range was significant. It covered the years when Aunt Linda had really started intensifying her campaign to turn me against my parents. I asked my mom what was in the box, and she got this stricken look on her face. She said it was just old paperwork, nothing important, but her reaction told me otherwise. She was clearly uncomfortable, kept glancing at the box like it might explode. My curiosity was fully activated now. I asked her directly what was in there that she didn't want me to see. She started crying, not the gentle tears of nostalgia, but the kind of desperate sobbing that comes from years of suppressed pain. She told me she couldn't talk about it, that there were legal restrictions that prevented her from explaining certain things. But she also said that I was an adult now, that maybe it was time for me to understand what had really happened during my childhood. She said the answers were in that box, but she couldn't be the one to show them to me. Then she left, just walked upstairs and left me alone with the box. I sat there for probably an hour, staring at that cardboard container like it was going to tell me its secrets without me having to open it. Part of me wanted to just put it back and pretend this conversation had never happened. But the bigger part of me needed to know what had caused my mom such obvious pain. Inside the box were legal documents, court papers, and a bunch of old cassette tapes with dates written on them in my dad's handwriting. The paperwork was mostly incomprehensible legal jargon, but I could make out enough to understand that it involved some kind of custody dispute and restraining orders. The tapes were labeled with dates ranging from 1999 to 2003, and they all had the same notation: phone conversations, evidence. My hands were shaking as I found an old cassette player in another box and popped in the tape marked June 15, 1999. What I heard changed everything. It was Aunt Linda's voice, but not the warm, caring tone I'd grown up with. This was cold, calculated, threatening. She was talking to my father, and the conversation was clearly being recorded without her knowledge. She was demanding that my parents give her a share in my dad's business, claiming that she deserved compensation for all the help she'd been providing with my care. When my dad tried to explain that the business was struggling and couldn't support another partner, she got vicious. She said that if they didn't give her what she wanted, she'd make sure I knew what terrible parents they really were. She convinced me that they were abusive, that they didn't love me, that I'd be better off without them. She said she'd turn me against them so completely that they'd lose me forever. The most chilling part was when she said that she'd already started planting seeds of doubt in my mind, that I was already beginning to prefer her company to theirs. She laughed as she described how easy it was to manipulate a child's perception of reality. My dad's voice was barely a whisper as he asked her why she would want to hurt an innocent child just to get back at them. Her response was that this wasn't about me. It was about them paying for what they'd done to her. I listened to tape after tape, each one revealing more of Aunt Linda's elaborate plan to destroy my relationship with my parents. She'd record their phone conversations, document their attempts to reason with her, catalog every tactic she used to turn me against them. The most devastating tape was from 2001, when I was about 12. My parents were talking to their lawyer about the situation, and my mom was sobbing in the background. She kept saying that she couldn't bear to watch me grow up hating them, that maybe they should just give Aunt Linda what she wanted so she'd stop poisoning my mind against them. My dad was crying too, which was something I'd never seen him do. He said that giving in to her demands would bankrupt them, but he was willing to do it if it meant getting their son back. The lawyer was explaining that there were legal complications, that Aunt Linda had been careful to document everything in a way that would make my parents look bad if they tried to restrict her access to me. There was a court order that prevented my parents from saying anything negative about Aunt Linda to me, anything that might be construed as parental alienation. They were trapped in this nightmare situation where they had to watch their sister-in-law systematically destroy their relationship with their child, and they couldn't even defend themselves without risking legal consequences. The last tape was from 2003, and it was just my mom talking to the lawyer. She was asking if there was any way to make the recordings public, to show me what Aunt Linda had really been doing. The lawyer explained that the tapes might not be admissible in court, and that revealing them could actually make things worse for my parents legally. My mom made the decision to keep the tapes as evidence, hoping that someday, when I was old enough to understand, she could show me the truth. But years passed, and our relationship had become so damaged that she never found the right moment to reveal what she knew. I spent the rest of that night listening to every single tape, piecing together the complete picture of Aunt Linda's manipulation. She'd systematically isolated me from my parents, convinced me that their love was fake, and made me believe that she was my only true ally. Every gift she'd given me, every fun weekend, every moment of seeming care and affection, it had all been part of a calculated plan to steal me away from my parents as revenge for some perceived slight I still didn't fully understand. Final update. The hardest part about learning the truth wasn't the betrayal itself, it was realizing how much pain I'd caused my parents by believing Aunt Linda's lies. I'd spent years treating them like strangers, rejecting their attempts to connect with me, and planning to sue them for crimes they'd never committed. I confronted my parents the next morning, and for the first time in my adult life, we had a real conversation. They explained that Aunt Linda had always been jealous of their relationship, resentful that my mom had found happiness when she hadn't. When my dad's business started becoming successful, her jealousy turned into something darker. The legal complications had made it impossible for them to simply cut her out of our lives. She documented everything in a way that made it look like she was a concerned aunt protecting a child from neglectful parents. Any attempt to restrict her access to me would have been seen as proof of their guilt. So they'd endured years of watching their child grow up believing they didn't love him, all while knowing that the person who was supposed to be family was actively working to destroy their relationship with me. They'd been afraid to show me too much affection because Aunt Linda would twist it into evidence of manipulation. They'd been afraid to discipline me because she'd call it abuse. They'd been afraid to be themselves because everything they did was being scrutinized and reinterpreted through the lens of her lies. The worst part was that they'd blamed themselves. They thought that maybe they really were bad parents, that maybe Aunt Linda was right about them being cold and distant. They'd spent years in counseling, trying to figure out what they'd done wrong, never realizing that the problem wasn't their parenting but their inability to compete with someone who had no moral boundaries. When I asked them why they'd never fought back harder, my mom just looked at me with these tired eyes and said that they'd been afraid of losing me completely. At least with Aunt Linda's manipulation, they still got to see me sometimes. If they'd pushed too hard legally, they might have lost me altogether. We all cried that morning. I cried for the years of love I'd rejected. They cried for the pain they'd endured in silence. And we all cried for the childhood that had been stolen by someone who was supposed to care about our family. Confronting Aunt Linda was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I went to her house with copies of the tapes, and I played them for her. I expected her to deny everything, to try to convince me that the recordings were fake or taken out of context. Instead, she just sat there with this cold expression and asked me what I wanted from her. When I told her I wanted to understand why she'd done this to us, she actually laughed. She said that my parents had always thought they were better than her, that they'd had everything handed to them while she'd had to struggle for everything. She said that watching them suffer as they lost their child was the most satisfying thing she'd ever experienced. She'd enjoyed every moment of my rejection of them, every time I'd chosen her over them, every time I complained about how terrible they were. The most chilling thing she said was that she'd been disappointed when I hadn't followed through with the lawsuit. She'd been looking forward to watching them lose everything in legal fees, to seeing their reputations destroyed in court. When I asked her if she'd ever actually cared about me, she looked at me like I'd asked a stupid question. She said I'd been a useful tool, nothing more. All those years of gifts and attention and seeming love had been investments in her revenge plot. I left her house that day and never spoke to her again. I changed my phone number, blocked her on social media, and made it clear to everyone in our family that I wanted nothing to do with her. The rebuilding process with my parents has been slow but incredibly rewarding. We're learning how to be a family again, how to trust each other, how to make up for all the lost time. They're not perfect parents, no one is, but they're good people who loved me even when I made it incredibly difficult for them to do so. We've started new traditions, found common interests, and slowly built the kind of relationship that Aunt Linda's manipulation had prevented us from having. My mom and I go hiking together now, something we never did when I was growing up because I was always too busy with my weekend plans. My dad and I work on his old car in the garage, and he tells me stories about his childhood that help me understand him better as a person. The strangest thing is how different my memories of childhood look now that I understand the context. Those moments when my parents seemed distant or awkward weren't signs of indifference. They were signs of people walking on eggshells, terrified of doing anything that might give their manipulative relative more ammunition to use against them. I think about all the times I rejected their attempts to connect with me, all the times I chose Aunt Linda's house over family dinner, all the times I made them feel like failures as parents. It breaks my heart to know how much pain I caused them, but they've been incredibly gracious about forgiving me. They tell me that they never blamed me for believing Aunt Linda's lies. They said I was just a child who was being manipulated by an adult I trusted, and that the real tragedy was that someone who was supposed to love our family had been willing to destroy it for her own selfish purposes. I've learned that forgiveness isn't just about letting go of anger. It's about choosing to build something new from the wreckage of what was destroyed. My relationship with my parents will never be what it might have been if Aunt Linda hadn't interfered, but it can still be something beautiful and meaningful. We can't get back the years that were lost to manipulation and lies, but we can make sure that the years we have left are filled with the kind of love and connection that she tried so hard to prevent. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found those tapes, if I'd gone through my whole life believing that my parents were the cold, distant people Aunt Linda had convinced me they were. I might have sued them, might have cut them out of my life completely, might have never known the truth about how much they loved me all along. It's a reminder that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives aren't always accurate, and that sometimes the people who seem to care about us the most are the ones who are actually causing us the most harm. I'm grateful every day that I found out the truth, even though it came at the cost of losing someone I thought I could trust. My parents and I are building something new together now, something based on honesty and mutual respect rather than manipulation and fear. It's not the childhood relationship we should have had, but it's a foundation for the adult relationship we can still build together. And that's enough. It has to be enough.